Ladies, gentlemen, etc., today's ship needs no introduction. At long last, I bring you the most comprehensive look possible at the greatest ship in Star Wars. All 13 versions, variants, spin-offs, and kitbashes. I'm Joey from Radio Free Coruscant, and this is everything there is to know about the Gozanti Cruiser. Design. The original Corellian Engineering Corporation Gozanti-class cruiser, which by all accounts should really be referred to as a freighter, is probably my favorite version of the ship. It consisted of a long, narrow hull with the cockpit at the front, two short, stubby wing-like structures in the middle, and two longer pylons holding its main engines towards the rear, followed by its tapering tail. In this way, it was laid out very much like a real-world aircraft. The engines were fairly slow Gyrodyne Ter 58 ion drives. A smaller third engine sat under its tail in the middle. For some reason, it is listed in official sources as only having 2 engines, so perhaps this is not an engine at all, but is instead something like a reactor exhaust or an auxiliary power unit. We will assume it is an engine, though, and that its omission from official stat blocks is simply an error. The ship had a communications antenna on the top, on its right side, and 2 more in the center of the ship at the bottom, both facing each other. These may have been part of its cargo handling system instead, but it's hard to say. It wasn't stated to have tractor beams, but it would certainly make sense for it to. I think it's more likely that the ship just had great long-range communications equipment for speaking to multiple contacts in different directions at the same time. Both of the ventral dishes were attached to foldable arms that allowed them to partially retract on landing for safety. The rear-facing dish was also attached to a curious circular structure that doesn't seem to have an obvious purpose. I am inclined to think that it is a frame to hold an exterior hatch to one of its cargo holds, like the one seen on the VCX-100. There is even a rectangular piece inside of the circle that could be the door itself. The VCX-100 didn't need a giant circle around its bay door, but it was also much newer and not as over-engineered as the Gozanti. Speaking of cargo handling, the ship was boarded through a freight elevator on its chin section. It also had some kind of concealed airlock on its sides somewhere. Just in front of the freight elevator was the Gozanti's forward landing gear. It had 4 landing gear overall. The one at the very front, another one at the rear, and one on each side, making an unusual cross formation. Overall, the ship was designed to be as durable and impervious to pirates as possible. In fact, it would seem that all other design considerations were secondary to keeping pirates out. It had thick armor, good shields, concealed airlocks and weapons, great communications equipment to call for help, and more. It was aimed at companies shipping to or through high-risk areas where a lighter vessel would be in great danger of being captured by pirates. The only thing as important to its designers as keeping pirates out of its cargo holds was keeping them out of its cockpit. It was designed to be deliberately slow and clunky to make it as difficult to use it as a pirate ship as it was to make one a victim of piracy. The ship's designers in-universe are unknown, but in real life it was designed by the legendary Doug Chiang for the Phantom Menace. It was originally created as a concept for the Republic cruiser used by the Jedi, but instead ended up in the film as a freighter on Mos Espa, and the rest is history. Specifications. The size of the Gozanti Cruiser is somewhat complicated. Wikipedia would have you believe that it is 63.8 meters long by 32 meters wide and 14.7 meters tall, but it's not that simple. That figure is only for the Imperial Gozanti, and only one version of it at that. We'll get to that later, though. According to official Star Wars lore advisor Pablo Hidalgo, the Gozanti was just 45.7 meters long in The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, and 41.8 meters long in The Clone Wars. These sizes aren't impossible, but I don't really think they suit the ship very well at all. I will spare you the in-depth analysis that I had originally written, but its escape pods would be nearly inaccessible and unusably small at just 42 meters long, and its cockpit would be pretty cramped. That would be just 6 feet wide at 42 meters long, including the thickness of the hull, but a much more reasonable 9 feet at the 64-meter scale. Compare that to the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon. The Falcon is a smaller ship than either possible size of the Gozanti, yet has a roughly 3-meter or 10-foot wide cockpit. Not that cockpit size necessarily scales with the size of the ship overall, but the size of the 64-meter Gozanti's cockpit would be in line with pretty much every single other ship in this size range, while on a 42-meter Gozanti it would be minuscule. We can also see that the boarding platform of the C-ROC Gozanti, an upgrade to the ship built on the same frame, is the same size as that of the Imperial Gozanti, or around 13 feet wide compared to the 6-foot-tall height of Hondo Onaka. The only time we see the freight elevator of an original Gozanti in the Clone Wars, it is partly obscured by the forward landing gear, but it also appears to be over double the height of an adult Weequay, more or less proving that it must be the size of the Imperial Gozanti. So, I don't know, I just have a hard time believing it's only 42 or 46 meters long. That's just too small for the shape of the ship. There's a reason the Star Wars Rebels team upscaled it to 64 meters long, and I think we should apply that to the original civilian model too. I also just personally resent the idea of ships coming in multiple sizes, looking at you, entire separatist navy, so I don't really see why the Empire would look at the Gozanti Freighter and go, yes, make me a slightly larger version of that. The point of them using a Gozanti Cruiser is that it's mostly an off-the-shelf design adapted for their own purposes. It would be beyond stupid, even by Imperial standards, to make a bigger but visually identical version. You may as well just start over with a whole new fresh design at that point. Wouldn't be the first time, but it makes even less sense here, especially when you consider that it was originally designed as a concept for the much larger Consular Cruiser seen at the beginning of the Phantom Menace. The ship just has to be 64 meters long. And by the way, I'm not trying to fact-check Pablo Hidalgo here. I know this whole discussion began with me bringing up what size he said the Gozanti is, but he was specifically talking about the size of the VFX assets used in various places, while I am trying to figure out the size of the ship in-universe. While in theory, knowing the exact size of the VFX asset should tell you the exact size of the ship in-universe, sizes can be fudged to better suit a scene, retconned to fit evolving lore, or even just be wrong in the first place, especially in animation. A 42 or 46 meter long Gozanti just doesn't make sense, so we can safely assume that the civilian model is the same 64 meters long as the Imperial one. And before anyone asks, we do not need to reconcile the different sizes as being two versions existing simultaneously in-universe. There are enough Gozanti variants already, as you will soon see, and I find it very irritating when we end up with so-called dreadnought variants of ships, like those of the Recusant and Providence-class destroyers of the Separatist Navy I alluded to earlier. I don't think anyone is out there saying that this should be the case for the Gozanti, but I just wanted to make sure they wouldn't start. The civilian Gozanti is the same length as the Imperial Gozanti, and is the same basic frame used in the C-ROC Gozanti, because that is the only way any of those ships make sense. Smaller official Gozanti variants also exist, so we don't need to say that the original one came in more than one size itself. With that excruciatingly pedantic diatribe out of the way, let's get back to the specifications. Specifications, Take 2. As far as I'm concerned, the original Gozanti Cruiser measured 63.7 meters long by about 25 meters wide and 15 meters tall with its lower communications dishes unfurled. This was roughly equivalent in size to some Earth airliners, like the Boeing 777-200 or the Airbus A330-300. Its top atmospheric speed in canon was said to be 1,025 kilometers per hour, but I believe that refers only to the Imperial model. The ship was notable for being ponderously slow to discourage its use by pirates, so its Legends speed of 400 kilometers per hour may be more accurate. That almost seems too slow, but it's the best we've got. Personally, I would have thought something more like 650 kilometers per hour to be a suitably unsuitable speed to keep it out of the hands of pirates without holding legitimate freight captains back too, but I don't work for CEC, I guess. Anyway, the ship also had a Class 3 hyperdrive with a Class 12 backup in case of emergencies. It required a surprisingly large crew of 12, consisting of a pilot, co-pilot, engineer, comms and sensors operator, 2 loadmasters, and 6 gunners. The ship could carry 12 passengers, 75 tons of cargo, and 1 month of consumables. Then we come to the matter of its weaponry. Supposedly, it was armed with 4 retractable heavy laser cannons, 2 retractable quad laser cannon turrets, and a proton torpedo launcher. And while retractable weaponry is all well and good, that list seems to be missing something very important. Namely, the ventral laser cannon turret you can actually see on the ship. The official weapons loadout comes from an old RPG sourcebook called Starships of the Galaxy. However, this book was written 3 years before the first episode of the Clone Wars that the Gozanti appeared in, meaning its writers may have been unable to see the turret from the angles it is shown in from The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, so they didn't know it had a weapon already and made up their own loadout. But that begs the question. If the Starships of the Galaxy loadout is objectively incorrect, do we add the real turret to that list, or do we replace the list entirely? I will say it seems foolish to design a ship to be as unappealing to pirates as possible with some of the slowest ion drives in the galaxy, but give it more weapons than some capital ships. It's a lot easier to replace 2 conveniently exposed engines than it is to cut a bunch of holes in the hull to add 6 new heavy weapons. But maybe that's on purpose, who knows. At the end of the day though, there's no real reason it couldn't have all those weapons. I don't think ILM intended for it to be that heavily armed, and I doubt Lucasfilm Animation knew it had been assigned that lore in an RPG sourcebook when they adapted it for the Clone Wars. Both groups intended for it to be a fairly humble, ordinary freighter, and that is the interpretation of the ship I prefer. But at the same time, Wizards of the Coast was kind of cooking with their anti-piracy interpretation with so many weapons, so perhaps they can coexist. Perhaps the ship could be ordered with different weapons loadouts for different purposes. Crews going into dangerous pirate territory, like the Crate's Honor at Tatooine seen in The Phantom Menace did, could order the ship with all those concealed weapons, while captains running simple freight deliveries to safe worlds like Araxis in the Clone Wars could save some money and space within the hull by just getting the one external turret. And speaking of money, despite its substantial weapons loadout and fairly decent size, it wouldn't break the bank with a price of 150,000 credits new, or 50,000 used. History. The beginning of the Gozanti's history is sadly unknown to us, but it was designed by the Corellian Engineering Corporation and manufactured by them, Gallifrey Yards, and other minor shipyards. It was designed to appease Republic inspectors who were concerned that such a capable vessel would be too popular with pirates, and required it to have a very low speed so it couldn't be used to chase down other less well-armed and armored freighters. The class was in service at least as early as 32 BBY, when a Gozanti known as the Crate's Honor could be seen patrolling the Outer Rim, protecting independent merchants from Trade Federation privateers trying to eliminate competitors. Eventually, the Crate's Honor managed to save Jabba the Hutt from an attack on his private yacht, and the crime lord offered the crew of the ship protection from Trade Federation bounty hunters on Tatooine, where they set up a home base. The Crate's Honor was likely several years old by that point, and I would guess that the Gozanti class as a whole had likely been around for over a decade. In fact, I would be willing to bet that it was probably introduced sometime around 50 BBY. That would make it nearly 30 years old at the time of the Clone Wars, when its proven history of safe and reliable freight transport made it very popular with several factions in that conflict. It was still used en masse by thousands of independent transport operators, of course, but it was also officially adopted by the Separatist Navy. The Separatists upgraded it to have a twin laser cannon turret instead of the default single-barrel model, and painted it in their blue and gray colors, but otherwise it was essentially a stock Gozanti other than that. The Black Sun Crime Syndicate used Gozanti Cruisers as well, and performed the same modification to its turret. However, despite its mass popularity, the Gozanti class was beginning to show its age, and CEC began working on a replacement for the design. They actually came up with several. One proposal, presumably created for the Grand Army of the Republic, ended up being adopted by the Empire shortly after the Clone Wars and used throughout the reign of the Empire and beyond. Their replacement for the civilian Gozanti, though, was the Configuration Restored Operational Capacity upgrade, a complete overhaul of the ship to shed its pre-Clone Wars speed and cargo capacity restrictions. This version of the ship proved the Republic right in having restricted the original Gozanti by becoming incredibly popular with pirates, but we'll get to that in a minute. Despite the objective superiority of the C-ROC, the original Gozanti still remained extremely popular for decades after the Clone Wars, eventually spawning several other variants, in addition to the C-ROC. C-ROC Gozanti. The C-ROC Gozanti was the first variant of the Gozanti to be developed, and arguably the most popular. It was certainly the most popular of the civilian variants, only the Imperial Gozanti came close to exceeding it. Sometime around the beginning of the Clone Wars, it was decided that the Gozanti Freighter was beginning to show its age and needed an upgrade. The solution CEC devised was the Configuration Restored Operational Capacity Upgrade, or C-ROC Gozanti. While still built on the same basic frame as the original, it boasted several structural changes that significantly altered both its capabilities and appearance. The most obvious update was at the bow. The upper half of the Gozanti's nose was replaced with a much larger armored bow. This gave the ship significantly more internal cargo space, and likely even better armor than the already impressive original model could offer. Moving back towards the wing section, 4 external cargo racks were added to each side, further expanding its cargo capacity. At the rear of the ship was its other most significant change. The Gozanti's original 2 Gyrodyne Ter 58 engines were replaced by 4 Novaldex JV-80 ion drives, and an additional engine was added to the top of a tall pylon on the ship's spine. This is listed as being a JV-80 as well, but it appears to be a Ter 58 to me. Perhaps it was just placed into a Ter 58 housing for aesthetic purposes. Some captains opted to have this engine removed, likely for ease of maintenance or to improve handling. The smaller central engine in the ship's tail was still present as well. The C-ROC Gozanti was designed by Star Wars Rebels art director Killian Plunkett. The C-ROC Gozanti entered service sometime during the Clone Wars and saw limited use by separatist-aligned privateers, though the official navy preferred the original model. Pirates, smugglers, and legitimate freight companies purchased the ships in droves, though, and it quickly became as popular as the original. After the rise of the Galactic Empire, the Corellian Engineering Corporation pitched the C-ROC to the Empire as a companion vessel to the Empire's Gozanti Cruiser, though the Imperial Navy opted to stick with just the version they had. The C-ROC measured 73.9 meters long by about 22.6 meters wide and 21 meters tall. It had a much improved top atmospheric speed of 1,200 km per hour, but still the same Class 3 hyperdrive. It was said to be armed with the same 2 retractable quad laser turrets and 4 twin heavy laser cannons as the original Gozanti, which I am more inclined to believe for a heavily upgraded model such as this than I am for the original. Funnily enough, the official loadout is still missing the ventral twin laser cannon turret though. Additionally, a C-ROC Corsair refit conversion kit could be purchased that would add a more powerful reactor and additional turrets, fixed cannons, and ordnance launchers, though how many and what kinds aren't listed. Perhaps it is up to the customer. The C-ROC required the same 12 crew as the original Gozanti, and could carry 20 passengers by default, or hundreds with the right modifications. Not comfortably, I would imagine, but I guess the C-ROC is bigger than most passenger airliners, so maybe they have plenty of room. The ship's cargo capacity was the best bang for your buck of any ship in the galaxy, with roughly 4,000 tons of storage available between its internal holds and the quick-release racks on the wings. It's almost enough to wonder if it was a typo, and it's only supposed to carry 400 tons. But on the other hand, the cargo capacities of most other ships seem arbitrarily low, so I don't see why it couldn't have that much. The comparably sized Airbus A380 has a max takeoff weight of 575 tons, and that's just a normal Earth plane, so there's no reason a similarly sized spacecraft couldn't carry 7 times that much. It was also possible to modify the ship to carry 4 starfighters clamped below its hull, likely at the cost of some of its cargo capacity. This was mostly done by the Hutt cartel, who used it to carry their Mandel Motors M3A Psych interceptors. The C-ROC could also carry 2 months of consumables, compared to the original Gozanti's 1 month. The most impressive upgrade though, or lack thereof, was its price. Despite its massive improvements over the original, it cost only 40,000 more credits at a total of 190,000. Hybrid Gozanti. Now this next variant of the Gozanti is a strange one that requires a lot of speculative explanation. The Hybrid Gozanti first appeared at Port Borgo in Star Wars Skeleton Crew, and could also be seen on Navarro in The Mandalorian and Grogu, as well as in a Fortnite event promoting the film. This unusual ship had the front end and main hull of the Gozanti Freighter, but the back end of the Darius G-class freighter. Now, this cannot just be a case of the Port Borgo pirates combining together two ships they damaged in a raid, as the G-class is substantially larger than the Gozanti, around 215 meters long by 60 meters wide by my estimation. Over 3 times the size of the Gozanti. The Darius G components used in the Hybrid Gozanti are scaled down to match the Gozanti frame, so that implies a much more interesting origin for the ship. The original Gozanti was built by both CEC and Gallifrey yards, so perhaps CEC licensed the design out to Darius as well. That company then decided to make some modifications to the design, producing a version of the ship with capabilities and a visual style that would be more familiar to their existing customers. To further complicate the matter, the Darius G-class was itself already a kitbash of some new components and several severely upscaled components from the Lantillian shipwright's GX-1 short hauler. In fact, the components in question were the same rear section that was shrunk back down and grafted onto the Gozanti frame to make the hybrid. Maddeningly though, the GX-1 parts seen on the Hybrid Gozanti are still slightly larger than the originals, at least according to my size estimations. For example, the shared rear hull of the GX-1 was about 10 meters wide to start with, 37 meters wide on the Darius G, and 12 meters wide on the Hybrid Gozanti. I did try shrinking them down to be exactly the same size on the Hybrid as they originally were on the GX-1, but that just didn't look right. And so while these can't be literally the exact same components used on the GX-1, them being visually identical does imply an interesting relationship between Darius and Lantillian. We know next to nothing about either of these companies, other than that they built these ships. In Legends, Lantillian was acquired by Tag Co. in 0ABY, but that's pretty much it for Lantillian lore. So perhaps in canon it was acquired by Darius instead. However, I like to think it was always a subsidiary of Darius, or Darius was a subsidiary of it, or they were both subsidiaries of some other company like Tagco or maybe even CEC. Lantillian made fancy shuttles like the GX-1 and the Poland 717, while Darius made more industrial ships like the G-class. Perhaps they weren't even distinct subsidiary companies, just 2 different brands manufactured in the same plants and designed by the same engineers. Anyway, at some point, Darius bought or was given the license to produce their take on the Gozanti Freighter, which yielded this very interesting vessel. The ship had the main hull of the Gozanti with a different engine section at the rear. It had 2 engines that were slightly smaller than those of the original, as well as 2 downward-angled takeoff thrusters. There were 4 protective shrouds around the engines, and 4 large adjustable fins just ahead of them. In place of the original wing section on the base model Gozanti, the Hybrid had a rack for carrying external cargo containers. The civilian Hybrid seen on Navarro carried around 12 official Darius cargo modules designed to look like the much larger containers carried by the Darius G-class. The Pirate Hybrid from Port Borgo appears to be using some kind of aftermarket container design, with 8 slightly larger pods under its belly. There are a couple other minor visual differences between the two, like the layout of the blend point between the Gozanti and Darius G sections, but nothing so significant that it makes me think they are entirely separate classes of ship. More likely just 2 different depictions of the same thing in different art forms. The Hybrid Gozanti measured roughly 64 meters long like the original, but 21 meters wide and tall, not including its modular cargo pods. Most of its other stats can be supposed to be pretty much the same as the original, though it appeared to be unarmed. I would be shocked if it had less than double the cargo capacity of the original with all the cargo containers, but it's impossible to say how much just from looking at it, especially when we know it can carry at least 2 different kinds of containers as well. Surely it would be at least 150 tons though. Frankly, I think the base model should hold that much already, but I digress. That's Republic regulations for ya. I would also guess the hybrid to be slightly more expensive than the base model due to its more complex design with the fins and the external cargo racks, but probably not as much as the C-ROC Gozanti, perhaps 170,000 credits. Mini Gozanti. This variant of the Gozanti is a very interesting story as well. I believe it appeared in the background of several episodes of The Mandalorian, but always too far away to get a good look at it. At least I have always thought a couple of the Navarro ships reminded me of some kind of Gozanti, and now seeing this one up close, I can only assume this was it. There are a lot of very interesting looking background ships in The Mandalorian, and while we know basically nothing about them, a few of them did get names in the recent Mandalorian visual guide. Sadly, this was not one of them, but much to my surprise, it did appear a few weeks later in the Mandalorian and Grogu Fortnite promo event. So, what is this one? It appears to be roughly half of a Gozanti Freighter with the engines of the hybrid Gozanti stuck directly to the sides of it. There seem to be several of these ships on Navarro at once, so we know that it's not just a one-off hot rod somebody made, but we don't really have any more info than that. I believe that this may have been the Darius Corporation's attempt to break into the light freighter market. After producing the hybrid Gozanti, they may have decided to further alter the design and cut it down to a much smaller size to create a new class of ship without having to create new components from scratch. This resulted in a ship that was very cheap for them to design and produce, and could enter the market very quickly after deciding to make it. It would likely also benefit greatly from its use of a partial Gozanti hull as its base, with that ship's reputation for being extremely versatile and resistant to pirates. A potential customer would immediately know what this ship was about the moment they walked up to it, thanks to its inclusion of the iconic Gozanti nose, even if most of the rest of the ship had been removed. The Mini Gozanti measured about 31 meters long by 13 meters wide and 9 meters tall. And this isn't a scaled-down Gozanti Cruiser, by the way. The components used are the same size as those of the original and hybrid Gozantis, it's just had the rear half of the ship cut off. I would guess something like this would only require 2 crew and carry 50 tons of cargo and maybe 6 passengers. It likely had a cost of around 100,000 credits or so. Gozanti Armed Transport. Originating from The Rise of Skywalker and appearing in Skeleton Crew and Star Wars Outlaws since, the Gozanti Armed Transport is arguably the biggest departure from the standard format yet, with its bizarre barrel-shaped cockpit section and enormous forward windows. More importantly though, it is quite a lot smaller than the original Gozanti. Still bigger than the Mini Gozanti, but unlike the Mini, it actually is scaled down. This means that it likely does not share any parts with the original version other than possibly the engines, which seem to be the same size. Instead, it is basically just a new light freighter designed to resemble the Gozanti. I find it very odd that CEC did this, but that is what they seem to have done. Ironically enough, this is pretty close to the original intended size of the original Gozanti, though it seems to be a different size in each of the places it appears, so I would take that with a grain of salt. The size I'm choosing to acknowledge comes from the game model of the ship in Outlaws, and while Star Wars games are not always correct in their scaling, the windows on the front of the ship would be colossal if it were the size of the original, probably 2 decks tall. Maybe even 3 decks if the larger look seen in Skeleton Crew were to be believed. This isn't unheard of, but it is extremely rare, especially on cargo ships. It would also be quite foolish for a combat freighter like the Gozanti Armed Transport is implied to be, so we'll assume the cockpit windows are only regular huge instead of dangerously huge, and take the Outlaws size to be canon. Despite being much smaller than the original Gozanti, it still appeared to use the same main engines, or at least a very similar model. These were attached to much thicker pylons, and the smaller central engine was replaced with another large main engine. The wing section was moved to the back of the ship and made much less prominent. The ship also got a brand new rectangular communications antenna attached to an articulated arm on the right wing. This variant of the Gozanti was fairly uncommon, less popular than the original or the C-ROC by far, but not as rare as the hybrid or mini Gozanti. It saw some use by pirates and the Hutt cartel, but didn't really take off in criminal circuits like the C-ROC did. The Gozanti armed transport measured about 40.3 meters long by 23.1 meters wide and 7.4 meters tall. Its top atmospheric speed was likely substantially higher than that of the original thanks to its smaller size and proportionally larger engines, possibly even as high as the C-ROC's 1200 km per hour. I would imagine its hyperdrive rating remained the same. The ship supposedly required just one crew, and could carry several passengers and a small amount of cargo, perhaps around 50 tons like the mini Gozanti. Speaking of which, maybe this ship was CEC's answer to Darius's Gozanti Mini. Or maybe the Mini was Darius's attempt to further shrink the Gozanti after seeing the success of the Gozanti armed transport, without introducing new manufacturing costs by replacing all of the components with slightly smaller versions. Who knows? Anyway, it was armed with one dual laser cannon turret, and one forward heavy laser cannon, and possibly other concealed weapons. Its price was probably no more than 120,000 credits. Imperial Gozanti Mark I. Of course, the Gozanti Freighter was much more famous for its use by the Galactic Empire than for its various civilian applications. The Gozanti Cruiser, as the Empire referred to it, was a slightly upgraded variant of the Gozanti Freighter that was adapted into an extremely versatile multi-role light starship. It had several names within the Imperial Navy, reflecting its different uses. The ship could be called the Gozanti-class Cruiser, the Gozanti-class Armed Transport, the Gozanti-class Shuttle, Gozanti-class Vessel, or Gozanti-class Assault Carrier, depending on its configuration and who you ask. It was used for everything from prisoner or passenger transport to system patrols, capital ship escorts, planetary landing operations, starfighter carrier duties, and even the original freight hauling uses. There were at least two distinct versions of the Imperial Gozanti, as well as two sub-variants that were sort of a blend between them, and two significantly modified electronic warfare models. The original Imperial Gozanti Cruiser, which we will refer to as the Gozanti I for simplicity's sake, must have been in service at least as early as 18 BBY. A slightly different variant, what I call the Gozanti 1A, was used by the early Empire, and that ship was a cross between the Gozanti I seen in Star Wars Rebels in 5 BBY and the live-action Gozanti, or Gozanti II, seen in The Mandalorian in 9 ABY. We will get to the Gozanti 1A when we get there, but the Gozanti 1's hull was nearly identical to the original civilian model, and the Gozanti 1A had a couple of fairly noticeable changes, so I don't think it would make sense to make that ship the original Imperial model, then have them take some features off to produce the version seen in Rebels, Battlefront II, and Squadrons, and then put them back on for the one seen in The Mandalorian. Therefore, we must conclude that the Rebels version is the original Imperial Gozanti, as it always was, and must have been in service simultaneously with the Bad Batch version. So, the Imperial I was in service essentially immediately after the fall of the Republic. It was likely designed for the Republic, filling in a light transport role that they didn't really have at any point during the Clone Wars, and then was retained by the Empire after Order 66. The Gozanti I was fairly similar to the civilian Gozanti Freighter, with a nearly identical main hull. The geometry of its tail was slightly altered, and it had an additional laser cannon turret, but the biggest change was in its wing section. Instead of tapering back to the main hull and having separate pylons for the engines, it instead flared outward to hold the engines instead and mimic the shape of much larger Republic and Imperial warships. The engines were moved upward just a bit to be in line with the plane of the wings, but were otherwise the same model. Below the wings were the other biggest change to the Gozanti design. Its escape pods were moved to the center of the ship, and in their original locations, docking hardpoints for 4 tie line starfighters were installed. Nearly all standard-sized TIE variants could be carried, though larger models could only be carried 2 at a time instead of 4. The Gozanti was also capable of carrying various Imperial walkers from these docking points as well, including the AT-AT, AT-DP, and more. The 2 lower dishes of the original Gozanti and C-ROC variant were removed to make space for docked fighters and walkers as well. I wasn't able to conclusively determine who created the Gozanti I in real life, but presumably it was Killian Plunkett like the C-ROC was. The Imperial Gozanti I measured 63.8 meters long by 32 meters wide and 14.7 meters tall. Its speed, crew and passenger capacity, and most other stats were seemingly unaltered from the original, but that was a long time ago, so we'll go over them again. It had a top atmospheric speed of 1,025 km per hour and a Class 3 hyperdrive with a Class 12 backup. The ship required 12 crew and could carry 75 tons of cargo and 12 passengers. Supposedly, it was armed with 4 laser cannons, a proton torpedo launcher, and 2 quad laser cannon turrets, but it just isn't. This figure comes from a reference book about Imperial ground vehicles and seems to be based on the weapons loadout of the civilian Gozanti in Legends, but we already discussed that. I'm not sure why they used these weapons instead of what we can actually see on the ship in the show, but in reality it was armed only with either 2 twin laser cannon turrets or 1 twin laser turret and 1 heavy laser turret. To my knowledge, no depiction of the Imperial Gozanti from any of the shows, comics, books, or games has included more armament than this. In addition to its own weaponry, the Gozanti I could also carry up to 4 TIE series starfighters, or light walkers, or up to 2 heavy walkers. The ship came in at a cost of 200,000 credits. Imperial 1A. The development history of the Gozanti Cruiser seemed fairly straightforward until the Bad Batch Season 2 threw a little bit of a wrench in the works by introducing what I refer to as the Gozanti 1A. This version of the ship was mostly identical to the Gozanti I, but had a darker and more detailed hull texture, and incorporated a feature of the live-action Gozanti from The Mandalorian, its nose-mounted docking claw. The reason for this change is purely Doyleist. Out of universe, the art department of the show wanted to include a Gozanti Cruiser and needed to spruce up the asset used in Star Wars Rebels to match the Bad Batch's higher quality art style. The Mandalorian had just featured the ship, and because that version of it would be fresh in the audience's minds, the Bad Batch team incorporated its distinctive bull bar in the animated version as well. You can consider this a retcon or a continuity error if you would like, but I like to think both this and the regular Imperial Gozanti I do exist. The purpose of the Gozanti 1A is unknown, as its only differences besides color are the addition of the docking claw and omission of the side windows on its shoulder pieces. Given the civilian Gozanti's production by both CEC and Gallifrey yards, we could perhaps conclude that one company produced it with the claw and one without. Or more likely, CEC produced all Imperial Gozantis, as Gallifrey was in the process of going bankrupt at the time. A major Imperial contract, like producing a ship as common as the Gozanti, would have likely prevented this, so clearly that didn't happen. Instead, it seems more likely to me that CEC offered the ship with or without the docking apparatus. Different Imperial installations could choose which version they wanted to better suit their needs, and while most chose the almost certainly cheaper base model, a few opted for the upgraded version if they needed to dock at whatever sort of facility the bull bar was compatible with. All of the stats for the Gozanti 1A should be the same as the Gozanti I, other than possibly the price. I would expect it to be very close though, no more than 205 to 210,000 credits. The Gozanti 1A was designed for the Bad Batch by Scott Zanteno. Imperial 1B. The Bad Batch was not the only Star Wars property to introduce a strange cross between the original and live-action Imperial Gozanti Cruisers, as the game Star Wars Outlaws did the same thing shortly thereafter. The Outlaws Gozanti, or Gozanti 1B, was a much more unusual one, however. The game developers seem to have wanted to use the Gozanti II without going to all the work of creating an entirely new model of the ship, or were perhaps not allowed to by time or budget constraints. Instead, they opted to reuse the Gozanti I mesh from Battlefront II and Squadrons, and tacked a few things on to resemble the live-action version. However, due to the significant differences in proportions and details between the Gozanti I and II, which we will get to momentarily, it came out looking like a unique hybrid completely unlike either of its parent Gozantis. This is why I consider it its own variant. You are, of course, more than welcome to disagree. At some point between 18 BBY and the first appearance of the Gozanti II in 5 BBY, the Karelian Engineering Corporation began experimenting with a new heavy Gozanti design based on the 1A. The resulting vessel, the 1B, combined the lighter-colored, simpler hull of the Gozanti I with the docking bull bar of the Gozanti 1A, and made several additional changes. The dorsal communications dish was shrunk down to a fraction of its original size, perhaps for safety purposes to keep it from being shot off, or to stop it from blocking part of the field of fire for the dorsal laser turret. A second dish was also added at the ship's tail, possibly to make up for the loss in broadcast power or receiving capability from shrinking the other dish. The tail of the Gozanti was extended by a few feet to restore the geometry of the civilian Gozanti for some reason, where it had been slightly truncated on the Gozanti I and 1A. The most obvious change to the Gozanti 1B were its engine extensions. The engines themselves appear to be the same Gyrodyne Ter 58s seen on most other Gozanti variants, but a long extension cone was added to the back of each of them. I don't know what purpose this would serve, but presumably it either makes them faster or protects them from enemy fire better. Stats-wise, the Gozanti 1B was probably pretty much the same as the 1 and 1A. It was ever so slightly longer at about 65.4 meters long thanks to the bull bar and tail extension, and it may have been a bit more expensive than the 1A, perhaps 220,000 credits. The Gozanti 1B was designed for Star Wars Outlaws by Pablo Gallego Sanchez. Imperial Gozanti Mark II. Finally, we come to the most significant departure from the Imperial Gozanti format, at least of the standard multipurpose transports. The Gozanti II, or Heavy Gozanti, introduced in The Mandalorian Season 2, was redesigned from the ground up to be a fully new vessel. You may be inclined to argue that the Gozanti II is just a live-action reimagining of the ship with no in-universe implications, like most of the other ships that make the jump from animation to live-action. The Ghost from Rebels was redone with much greater detail, but is obviously meant to be exactly the same vessel, for example. A better example would be the T-6 and Ada-class shuttles seen in the Ahsoka series, which feature fairly significant aesthetic and structural changes, but are still obviously meant to represent the same class of ship as their animated counterparts, just better looking. And that would certainly be a plausible explanation for the live-action Gozanti as well, if it weren't for the fact that we already know what a live-action Gozanti looks like. Remember, the Gozanti originates from the Phantom Menace. The Clone Wars very faithfully reproduced its live-action appearance for animation, and then Rebels used this as a basis for the original Imperial Gozanti. A live-action Imperial Gozanti should look much the same as the animated one, because the animated design already comes from live-action. We have also seen a faux live-action interpretation of the design in Battlefront II and Squadrons, and the look of it holds up perfectly fine. So, the fact that the live-action Imperial Gozanti is so different from the original means that it must be a new model, the Gozanti II. The Gozanti II still followed the familiar layout of the Gozanti I and its spin-offs, but with a much smoother and thicker hull design. Its wings and shoulders were shaped slightly differently, and the whole ship overall was better armored. The ship appeared to have all new engines, which were a bit larger than the original Ter 58s. The central engine was also the same size as the outer two, rather than being a smaller model like on most other Gozanti variants. The various details around its hull differed as well. Obviously at the bow it had the already discussed docking claw, and just behind the cockpit were two dual laser turrets that were not present on previous models, which were also much larger and more heavily armored. The dorsal turret at the rear was replaced by one of the new turrets as well, and the rear ventral turret was removed, leaving it with one more turret than the Gozanti I. An exterior hatch and railing was added to the ship above its shoulder protrusions to allow stormtroopers to patrol the vehicle's exterior when landed. In theory, this would have been done in response to the infiltration and theft of numerous Gozanti Is by the Rebellion in the early stages of the Galactic Civil War, but several Gozanti IIs appeared in Andor, meaning that the 1 and 2 were used simultaneously by the Empire for some reason. We'll come back to that in a bit. Moving backward on the ship's hull, it had a large equipment well along its spine for various things, perhaps some sensors and the dorsal shield projectors. The Gozanti II omitted the dorsal communications dish, and had 2 short antennae at the tip of its tail. It also had a cargo bay with a large exterior loading door in the side of the ship somewhere as well, to facilitate easier and faster cargo transfer than was achievable with the freight elevator of the original, though it likely still had one of those too. The underside of the Gozanti II was much the same as the Gozanti I, just better armored and without the rear ventral turret. Its landing gear were slightly reconfigured, moving the side gear forward, adding an additional pair of side gear at the rear of the wing, and removing the rear center gear. A pair of boarding ramps were also added for the first time in Gozanti history, in roughly the center of the ship. The whole ship overall also likely included other improved features that we can't see as well, like better targeting computers and shields. As far as I can tell, the Gozanti II was designed for The Mandalorian Season 2 by Ryan Church and modeled by Rene Garcia. The Gozanti II was almost exactly the same size as the others, just a touch smaller at 62.75 meters long by 31.45 meters wide and 13.05 meters tall. It was likely faster thanks to its larger engines, though the weight of its extra armor could potentially cancel out the extra thrust. Still, I'd at least round its top atmospheric speed up to 1100 kilometers per hour. Its crew, passenger, and cargo quantities were likely the same as on the Gozanti I, and we know for sure its embarked craft complement was the same as well. Its weapons were improved to include 3 twin laser cannon turrets, possibly heavy lasers by the look of them. The price of the new model is unknown, but I would guess that it would almost certainly have to be at least 300,000 credits considering how little it has in common with the Gozanti I beyond its general layout and capabilities. Like I said, it was completely refurbished from the ground up, and with a whole new hull comes a whole new price. The Gozanti II is a clear improvement on the Gozanti I design, but its history is a bit confusing. Initially, when it appeared in The Mandalorian, it seemed that the Empire had simply upgraded the ship at some point based on lessons learned at the beginning of the Civil War. More durable engines, thicker armor, better weapons, lookout posts to protect landed Gozantis, whatever the deal with the docking bull bar is, etc. The Bad Batch's inclusion of the bull bar 30 years early was a little odd, but easily explained as just an alternate piece of equipment for the ship. The Gozanti 1B in Outlaws, with its mix of features, fit right in as an awkward transitional phase between them, further supporting this idea. But then the Gozanti II was seen in a couple episodes of Andor Season 2 set in 3 BBY. This implies that instead of being a successor, the Gozanti II was used simultaneously with the Gozanti I. This is perfectly fine, it just doesn't align with what we thought we knew about the ship. The complete timeline of the Imperial Gozanti is as follows. The Gozanti I and 1A were introduced roughly simultaneously in 19 BBY around the end of the Republic to fill the Empire's need for a light transport. However, the Gozanti class was already at least 15 years old at that point, probably more, and after a few years the Empire began looking for ways to improve the vessel. The Gozanti 1B entered service around 10 BBY to test several innovations designed around lessons learned from the 1 and 1A. Few 1Bs were built, but the Empire found them to be satisfactory and approved the production of a new Gozanti that would incorporate all of the new features of the 1B in a brand new hull design better suited to Imperial Navy procedures, facilities, and combat doctrine. The new Gozanti II was initially limited to core worlds such as Coruscant and important naval installations along critical trade routes like Port Steergard, but would eventually be rolled out to the rest of the galaxy over the course of the Galactic Civil War. This explains why we see the Gozanti II in 3 BBY in Andor, but not in the same year in Rebels. You may be inclined to say that this doesn't need to be explained in the first place, and in many cases I would agree with you, but when you can put together a seamless new sequence of events out of the on-screen evidence, you may as well. IGV-55. The Empire did not stop with just using the Gozanti design as a simple transport and carrier. It proved such a useful platform that they even developed 2 separate electronic warfare vessels from it. The more well-known of these, if you could call it that, was the IGV-55 surveillance vessel, also known as the Imperial Listener Ship or Gozanti-class espionage ship. This was a modified Gozanti I used for signals intelligence by the Imperial Information Office. It was capable of long-distance surveillance, remotely hijacking droids and computers, intercepting and jamming communications, and various other intelligence tasks. To do this, it was completely overhauled inside to install the necessary computers and control rooms, and it received extensive exterior alterations as well. For starters, it had a specialized composite stealth coating to minimize signal leaks and keep it from showing up on the sensors of every ship in the galaxy when in operation. Its engines were also encased in sensor-dampening insulation, and its bridge was electromagnetically insulated to protect its command crew from the radiation of the signals being sent directly over their heads. The most obvious change to the listener ship from the Gozanti I, though, was the installation of an enormous communications array on its back. This consisted of an active phased full-spectrum transceiver array and a passive dedicated energy receptor array on a tall mast, as well as a long-distance signal and sensor array dish and high-resolution hyperspectral imaging receiver mounted in a large disk in front of the mast. The exterior sensor array was inspired by real-world AWACS, airborne early warning and control craft such as the E-3 Sentry, and its surveillance operations center inside, as well as the staff that worked there, were inspired by George Lucas's first film, THX 1138. All of these things made it one of the most powerful spy vessels ever made, but there were also some other features that needed to be changed to accommodate them. To make up for the extra mass of all the sensor equipment, 2 smaller ion drives were added to the wings just outboard of the original TER-58s. These appear to be a very similar model, just a little bit smaller. Furthermore, unnecessary weight was removed from the wing section by trimming it into a fully rectangular shape except for a small extension at each end to hold on the extra engines. Perhaps the IGV-55 was initially developed with just the original 3 engines in mind, but was found to be too slow even after the extra weight of the square fronts of the wings was removed, and so these engines and extensions were tacked on afterward. Because of the trimmed wings, the IGV-55 no longer had room for the 4 ventral docking tubes, and 2 of them were removed. The IGV-55 measured 62.75 meters long by 36.66 meters wide and 21.95 meters tall. It had a top atmospheric speed of 900 kilometers per hour and a Class 1 hyperdrive. Its total crew count and passenger capacity are unknown, but they were probably still around the same as the original, 12 and 12. The ship was armed with 2 dual heavy laser cannon turrets and sensor jammers, and could carry 2 TIE Line starfighters for defense if it was going to a potentially dangerous location. They were not typically seen with fighters, though. Well, they weren't typically seen, period, but you know what I mean. The price of the listener ship is unknown and virtually impossible to estimate. I would make a ballpark guess of 300 to 500,000 credits, but it's very hard to say without knowing the cost of all the computer equipment. Imperial Scan Cruiser. And finally, our last Gozanti variant, at least our last real one, is the Imperial Scan Cruiser, an even more rare and mysterious ship than the IGV-55. This ship was used in the Imperial supply census, and while its exact role is unknown, it could presumably scan a planet's surface for resources, personnel, and equipment to examine. It may have also played a role in jamming communications to and from planets being audited, and landing ground troops and vehicles involved in the audit. The ISC was built on the frame of the Gozanti II, and was in service at least as early as 4 ABY. The wings of the Gozanti were removed and its engines moved to the center of the hull, bunched together in a tight triangular formation. It had a very large sensor cluster towards the front of the ship under its chin, and another dish installed on top of its rear dorsal turret. There were also several antennae installed on its sides beneath the shoulder sections. The ISC measured around 63.8 meters long by 13.3 meters wide and 15.5 meters tall. Its top speed and hyperdrive rating were probably comparable to that of the Gozanti II, and it presumably carried the same 12 crew and 12 passengers as every other Gozanti variant. Its cargo capacity was likely reduced with the extra communications equipment, perhaps to just 25 tons. I would estimate its price to be somewhere around 250 to 300,000 credits, but more is possible as well. Unidentified Ferrex Kitbash. While we have gotten through all the real Gozanti variants, it would be remiss not to mention a couple of honorable mentions. I have found 2 additional background ships that appear to be kitbashes of Gozanti components out of universe, but don't actually appear to be related to the class in universe. The first of these is an unidentified ship at Zorby's shiplot on Ferrex. This vessel's hull was very clearly copied from the civilian Gozanti, but much smaller based on the look of its large cockpit windows and the 4 Y-wing style engines it had. I did briefly wonder if this might be a mini Gozanti with the Darius engines swapped out for Koensayr ones, but the mini Gozanti had the same cockpit windows as the original according to Fortnite, so that doesn't seem to be the case. And of course, the mini Gozanti was still based on the original Gozanti frame, while this ship was much smaller. The purpose and history of this ship are obviously unknown, but I would guess that it was probably a light transport akin to the much earlier Brion Dayvan. I assume it was built by Koensayr given its use of Y-wing engines, though they could obviously be aftermarket replacements and can't be fully trusted to inform us about anything other than its size. Its resemblance to the Gozanti may be just a coincidence in-universe, though it could certainly have been built to look like one to help boost sales too. I doubt there was any official partnership between CEC and Koensayr on this vessel like I posited there was with CEC and Darius for the hybrid and mini Gozantis, since it doesn't use the exact same hull like those do, but I suppose it could be possible. The Koensayr Gozanti lookalike was comparable in size to the Y-wing at around 17 meters long by 10 meters wide and 5 meters tall, assuming the engines are indeed the same as those of the Y-wing and are mounted at the same width. We only see it from the side as far as I know, so it could hypothetically be wider or narrower, and we'd have no way of knowing, but that doesn't really matter since we don't know anything else about it either. It would probably be very fast with 4 of them, perhaps even up to 1500 km per hour in atmosphere. If true, this would make it exceptional for couriers, smugglers, and the like. And even if not, it would still be pretty good for them. There isn't really anything else we can discern from what little we can see of it, so let's move on to the other Gozanti Kitbash. AAC-39 Freighter. Our other honorable mention, and the very last ship in this video, is the recently named AAC-39 Freighter. Well, the name has been around for a few years, but it was only recently revealed to be the name of this specific ship. The AAC-39 was a fairly common background ship seen throughout The Mandalorian. It combined several pieces of concept art for the Razor Crest into one vessel, and for Season 3 it appears to have been spruced up with a new model suitable for close-up shots. It only got 2 of them, but in those shots we can see that it appears to use the wing section of the Imperial Gozanti II, scaled down to fit on a Razor Crest-sized ship. I'm not 100% sure it's copied from the Gozanti, as the bevel on the edge doesn't look quite right in one of the shots, but it's the same shape with proportionally similar engines in the same spots, so even if it's not technically taken from the Gozanti II mesh, I probably would still have included it as an honorable mention anyway. Plus, its landing gear are copied from the Gozanti as well, though that doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things. We don't really know anything about this ship yet, other than that it was a freighter, and likely a CEC product. It was probably popular with independent merchants and other small businesses, and I wouldn't be surprised if it saw use by small-time pirates as well. Based on the size of its airlocks and the people standing next to it at the Navarro spaceport, it would seem the AAC-39 measured about 23 meters long by 16.5 wide and 8.8 tall. We can't really discern much else just by looking at it, but it was armed with a dual laser cannon turret, and I would guess it to have a price of at least 100,000 credits. There are probably other background ships out there that use Gozanti components, but the Ferrex ship and the AAC-39 are the only two I've ever noticed or heard about. Let me know if you've spotted any others. But they were all of them deceived, for another Gozanti Kitbash was made. Just by coincidence, I happened to find another Gozanti Kitbash while editing this video. I was looking through my collection of footage for a shot of the Ghost's ventral cargo hatch when I happened to spot a Clone Wars-style Taylander shuttle in the thumbnail of one of the clips. This led me down a rabbit hole of looking at different Rebels episodes the Taylander appeared in, because I thought that show exclusively used a scaled-up version of the ship. What I found was fascinating, at least to me anyway, but I'll save that for its own video. Long story short, I ended up with the conclusion that there are 5 different models of the Taylander shuttle. The original live-action model from Attack of the Clones, the version seen in the Clone Wars and apparently Rebels, a slightly altered version of that one, also from Rebels, the much larger version used by Mon Mothma in Rebels, and one called the Taylander XCE shuttle from The Mandalorian. And when I went to find an image of the XCE to complete my collection, I was shocked to discover that it had the same 4 wedge things on its underside as the Gozanti does, as well as a fairly Gozanti-like lower hull. This was another Gozanti Kitbash, and I had nearly left it out of this video. What is interesting about the Taylander XCE is that it is a Gallo-free yards product like the Gozanti itself is. While I don't think that the Gozanti parts on it are actually built out of the same components as the Gozanti, because the shuttle is far too small for that, it would seem that Gallo-Free copied the design for their latest iteration of the Taylander shuttle. Its main hull might also be the same design, just scaled down like on the Koensayr thing from Ferrex, but it's extremely hard to tell. The only place we can get a good look at it is in the Mandalorian Visual Guide, and I don't have that book, so I have to rely on a screenshot from a video of someone reviewing it on YouTube. I decided to err on the side of it looking like all the other Taylander shuttles, though, since the rear end of it was clearly very similar. The Taylander XCE measured about 22 meters long by 9.5 meters wide and 6.5 meters tall, though it's very hard to tell. It could be anywhere from 15 to 25 meters long. Unusually for a Taylander shuttle, it appeared to be armed with a dual laser cannon turret. The ship probably required a crew of 1 or 2 and could carry 10 or so passengers. I would guess it to cost no more than 100,000 credits. And that's everything there is to know about the Gozanti Cruiser and all its variants. Please let me know what you think of this ship, and if you think I left anything important out. Actually, on second thought, I don't think I want to know. This video is the biggest one I have ever made, or will likely ever make, for this channel, so I would be very upset to discover I have left something out. Instead, leave a comment with which version is your favorite. I've always been partial to the original civilian model, but the new Darius hybrid version from Skeleton Crew is pretty good too. Probably my second or third favorite. Actually, let's rank them quick, just for fun. This video is probably already 60 minutes long, so what's 5 more? I think I'd put the Imperial Gozanti 1B from Outlaws in last place. It's fine, but kind of weird and not that appealing. Same story with the Scan Cruiser and the IGV-55. Moving on to variants I am quite fond of, I'd put the Mini Gozanti above that, then the Imperial Gozanti II, then the Imperial Gozanti I, and then the Gozanti 1A from the Bad Batch. It's tough to decide between the C-ROC and the Hybrid for third and second place, but the C-ROC just looks so good with those 4 big engines. The one dorsal engine is a little awkward, but not enough to lose at any points, and the Hybrid has no shortage of awkwardness either. That puts the Hybrid in third place, the C-ROC in second, and like I said, the original in first place. Anyway, we are bringing back the Long Attention Span Club for this monster of a video, so if you're a member, let me know by sharing your ranking of all the variants, or just by including whatever emoji you think most resembles the Gozanti in your comment if you don't feel like writing out your thoughts on all 11 variants. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, especially for such a large project. I probably won't do another video of this length again, certainly not for a long time if I do, but we'll see. The right ship for it might come along someday. You never know. What I do know, though, is that I will see you next week. RFC, out.